The riverbank was no longer empty. Elias Thorne saw them first as grey shadows against the grey dawn. The mist was thick, clinging to the cold surface of the water, but it could not hide the horses. They stood shoulder to shoulder, breath pluming in the iron air. They were statues of bone and muscle waiting, and on their backs the riders. He counted 10, then 20. More appeared from the pines on the far bank, silent as the falling snow. They wore no war paint, but their faces were hard as the granite peaks above them. They carried lances and rifles and the dark eyes of men who had ridden far, and for a purpose. Elias did not move. He stood in the open doorway of his cabin, the cold wood rough against his palm. He had felt their arrival before he heard it. A pressure in the air, a stillness that was heavier than the usual mountain silence. His cabin, which had felt like a fortress against the winter, now felt like a trap, a small wooden box on a wide, cold plain. He looked back inside. The girl was still asleep, wrapped in his last buffalo hide by the cold ashes of the fire. She was small, perhaps 9 winters old, and her breathing was the only sound in the small room. He had known this was coming. Maybe not this, not an entire war party, but he knew the act of last night would not go unanswered. The mountains always kept score. You did not take a thing or give a thing without the land noticing, and he had given his last meal to her. He looked back at the riders. They were Arapaho. He recognized the beadwork on the leader's quiver. He had traded with their people once, 2 seasons ago, but trade was different from this. This was a reckoning. The leader, a tall man with 3 eagle feathers tied in his hair, raised his hand. It was not a greeting, it was a signal to halt. The line of warriors stopped. They just watched. Elias looked down at his own hands. Empty. His rifle was inside, leaning against the wall. Useless. To reach for it now would be his last mistake. He had survived the cholera in St. Louis. He had survived the Blackfeet on the Yellowstone. He had survived winters that would freeze a man's prayers in his throat. He had survived by being quiet, by being respectful, and by knowing when to stand still. This was a time to stand still. His stomach ached. The hunger was a cold, sharp stone inside him. It reminded him of what he had done, the cost. The girl had eaten. He had not. Now her people were here. He assumed they were her people. They had tracked her through the snow, through the storm. They had followed her tiny, failing footsteps right to his door. He wondered what they saw. A lone white man, a lost child, a closed door. In their minds, the story must have written itself, a story of capture, a story of violence. He had to change the story. He had to show them the truth. But truth was a slippery thing in this high, cold country. It often looked different depending on which side of the river you were standing on. He took a slow breath, letting the freezing air fill his lungs. He would not show fear. He would not show aggression. He would show what he was. A man at the end of his rope who had made a choice. He took 1 step out of the doorway onto the snow. He kept his hands open, away from his body. He nodded once, a simple gesture of acknowledgement. The tall warrior watched him, his face unreadable. The silence stretched. The riverbank was covered. And Elias Thorne stood alone, waiting for the first word or the first arrow. The fire crackles low. The air is still. The night is deep and the stars are sharp. It's a good time to listen. We all come from somewhere, drawn to stories like moths to a flame. If this story finds you well, leave a word in the books below. Tell us what part of the world you are listening from. We are all travelers here, just sharing the warmth for a time. The day before had been clean and hard and empty. Elias Thorne had checked his trapline at dawn, walking 10 miles through snow that came up to his knees. The pines were heavy, their branches bowed low. The silence was absolute. He found nothing. The traps were sprung by the wind or filled with snow. No rabbits, no marten, not even a squirrel track. The animals knew the storm was coming. They had gone to ground hidden deep in the earth and were waiting. Elias had no such luxury. He was not of the earth. He was just on it. He was a tall man, but the wilderness had pared him down. He was lean muscle and bone, his face mapped by sun and wind. He had come west to escape the memory of a small graveyard in Ohio, a wife and a son taken by the fever. He had sought solitude, a place so vast and so empty that his grief would have room to breathe. He found it here in the shadow of the peaks. But the land demanded payment for its beauty. The price was attention, the price was work, and the price was hunger. His cabin was small, just one room built tight against a granite ledge, protected from the worst of the wind. Inside, it was sparse. A cot of pine boughs, a small stone fireplace, a few iron pots, and a hook where his winter provisions should have been. It was nearly empty. He had miscalculated the winter. He had expected the herds to move through the valley, but they had stayed high, away from the deep drifts. His hunt 2 weeks ago had failed. The elk had sensed him a mile off and vanished. He returned to the cabin as the sky turned a bruised purple. The wind was picking up. It mowed around the eaves, a low, hungry sound. He was tired. The cold had settled deep into his bones. He knew, with the cold certainty of a man who lives by the arithmetic of survival, that he had a problem. He had perhaps 3 days of firewood stacked by the door. He had a little coffee, and he had one last strip of smoked venison. It was thick, cured with salt, and tough as leather. It was meant to be his strength. Enough to let him make one more hunt, one more long walk to the southern pass, where the deer might be yarded up. He sat by the small fire, the venison in his hand. He weighed it. It was the weight of 3 more days, or the weight of failure. He had come to these mountains to be free, but he had just become a slave to his own belly. He thought of his son, Daniel. The boy had always been hungry, always full of life. He would have hated this quiet. He would have hated this cold. Elias put the jerky down. He would eat half tonight, just enough. He would save the rest. He would hunt tomorrow. The storm would break. It had to. The mountains were a test, but they were not, he believed, without mercy. He still believed that. It was his one remaining luxury. The storm hit just after midnight. It did not come gently. It arrived like a fist, a wall of wind and ice that shook the small cabin. The world disappeared outside his one small window. There was only the white, howling dark. Elias sat by the fire, feeding it stick by stick, nursing the flames. The cabin groaned. He was safe, he was warm, but his stomach was empty. He had decided to wait, to save the entire strip of venison for the morning. He needed the strength for the hunt. It was in the deepest part of the night, when the wind seemed to pause to take a breath, that he heard it, a sound. It was not the wind, it was not a branch, it was a scratching, a desperate, weak sound at his door, like a small animal, a lynx, perhaps, driven mad by the storm. He grabbed his rifle. He moved to the door, listening. The scratching came again, then a soft thud, as if a body had fallen against the wood. Elias unbarred the door. He opened it just a crack. The wind tore it from his hand, slamming it open against the wall. Snow and ice flooded the cabin, extinguishing the fire, plunging the room into darkness. He cursed, shielding his eyes. And then he saw it. A shape, a small bundle of rags and snow lying on his doorstep. He lowered the rifle. He reached down, his hands finding not fur, but frozen cloth. He pulled the shape inside. He fought the wind and managed to slam the door shut, barring it. In the sudden, roaring silence, he relit a taper. The small flame illuminated the figure. It was a child, an indigenous girl, her face blue with cold, her black hair matted with ice. She was unconscious, but she was breathing. He looked at her, his mind racing. A lost child. In this storm, She must have come from the Arapaho winter camp, 10 miles north. She must have been lost, wandering for hours. He saw her moccasins. They were worn through. He worked quickly. He stripped off her frozen outer layers. He wrapped her in his own blanket, the only one he had. He rubbed her hands and feet, trying to bring life back to them. Her eyes fluttered open. They were wide, dark, and full of terror. She tried to speak, but only a dry whisper came out. She was starving. He knew that look. It was the hollow space behind the eyes. He stopped. He looked at the fire, now just embers. He looked at the girl, and he looked at the single strip of venison on the shelf. His 3 days, his hunt, his survival. He looked at the girl again. Her eyes were fixed on it. She knew what it was. He picked it up. He did not hesitate. He could not. He cut a small piece with his knife. It was too tough for her. He put it in his own mouth, chewing it, softening it, the way a mother bird would. He then gave the small, warm piece to her. She ate. He gave her another, and another. He fed her his last meal piece by piece until the venisa was gone. She ate, and then, wrapped in his blanket, she fell into a deep, exhausted sleep by the hearth. Elias Thorne sat back, his stomach empty, his hands trembling slightly. He had made his choice. He had given his word to the mountains without speaking a sound. He had tied his fate to hers. The long night began. Elias sat in his one chair, his rifle across his knees. He was not sleeping. The cabin was cold. The fire was dead, and he dared not use more wood, saving it for the morning. The girl needed the warmth more than he did. He listened to the storm. It was a living thing, a great beast trying to claw its way in. But the cabin held. It was built of strong pine and sealed with his own stubbornness. He felt the hunger. It was no longer a sharp stone. It was a hollow ache spreading through his chest. He was weak. He watched the girl. In sleep, she looked even smaller. She was from the people. He respected them. They knew the mountains in a way he never could. They were part of the wind, part of the stone. He was just a visitor, a ghost. He wondered what had driven her out into the storm. Had she been fleeing? Had she been lost? He checked her again. She had no wounds. Just the cold and the hunger. He had fixed the hunger. The cold was outside. For now. He thought about the morning. The storm would break. It always did. And when it did, he would be faced with a new problem. He could not keep her. He was starving himself. He could not take her back to her people. He did not have the strength to walk 10 miles through deep snow, carrying a child. And he could not send her. She would die. He was trapped. This act of kindness, this simple human act, had trapped him as surely as any bear trap. He felt a strange calm settle over him. He had faced death before. He had faced it in Ohio, in the quiet, sick room. He had faced it on the plains, when the stampede turned his wagon to splinters. It was an old companion. It did not frighten him. But this felt different. This was a choice. He had chosen to give his last meal. He had chosen to save her, and in doing so had perhaps doomed himself. There was a clean line to it, a simplicity. He found himself thinking that if this was his last night, it was a good one. He had not died alone, clawing for one more breath. He had died in a warm cabin after feeding a child. The hours passed. The wind finally began to die down. The howling became a moan, then a whisper. The darkness in the window began to thin, turning from black to a deep indigo. Dawn was coming. The girl stirred. She sat up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. She looked at him. The terror was gone. She was just a child, awake in a strange place. She looked at the empty shelf where the venison had been. She looked at him. She didn't. Next, he looked at the door. He understood. She was waiting for her people. She knew they would come. Elias rose. His legs were stiff. The hunger made him dizzy. He walked to the door. He needed to see. He needed to see what the world looked like. After the storm, he needed to see if the mountains had shown any mercy. He unbarred the door. He pulled it open. The clean, cold air hit him. The snow had stopped. The world was white, pristine, and silent. He stepped out, squinting against the new light. And that is when he saw them. The shadows against the grey, the horses on the riverbank, the reckoning. He had thought his choice was private. He was wrong. The mountains had been watching. He stood on the snow-covered ground, his hands open. The tall warrior with the eagle feathers watched him. The man's face was like carved stone. He held a long rifle across the front of his horse. The other warriors fanned out, forming a half-circle, their horses stamping nervously in the snow. They were a wall of silent judgment. Elias knew this was the delicate moment, the moment that decided everything. It was a balance, a wrong move, a flicker of fear, a reach for a weapon, and the snow would be stained red. The girl chose that moment to appear. She stepped out of the cabin, still wrapped in his buffalo hide. She stood beside Elias, a small, dark figure against the white snow. The moment she appeared, the tension on the riverbank changed. It broke. The tall warrior's face, so hard, suddenly cracked. He let out a cry, a sound that was not a war cry, but a prayer. He slid from his horse. He ran through the shallow part of the river, the freezing water splashing, his moccasins soaking. He ran to the girl. "Ne eso," she cried, and ran to him. He grabbed her, lifting her high, checking her face, her hands. He was her father. Elias saw it now. The man's name was Two Elk. He had seen him at the trading post, a man of great standing. He held his daughter tight, burying his face in her hair. The other warriors watched, their stern faces softening. They were not a war party, they were a rescue party. They were fathers, they were uncles, they were brothers. They had been riding through the storm, hearts full of ice, expecting the worst. Two Elk finally looked up, his daughter safe in his arms. He looked at Elias Thorne. His eyes were dark, but the hardness was gone. He was looking at the man who had his child. He walked toward Elias, stopping just a few feet away. He looked past Elias into the small, cold cabin. He saw the empty shelf. He saw the cold fireplace. He saw the single blanket on the floor. He looked back at Elias. He saw the man's gaunt cheeks. He saw the hunger in his eyes. He understood, in that instant, the entire story. The cold, the storm, the last meal. "You are hungry," Two Elk said. It was not a question. Elias just nodded. "The storm was long." She is all I have," Two Elk said, his voice thick. He held his daughter, Morning Star, tighter. "She was cold," Elias said. "I had a fire." "She was hungry," Two Elk insisted, his gaze intense. "I had food," Elias replied. Two Elk looked at the empty cabin again, and then back at the man. He knew what food meant, the last strip of jerky, the final provision. The mountain man had given his own survival to his daughter. This was a debt that could not be paid with horses or hides. This was a debt of honor. Two Elk turned to his men. He spoke, his voice sharp in the cold air, barking orders in Arapaho. The reckoning was not over. It had just begun. The riverbank came alive. The warriors, who moments before had been symbols of menace, became men of action. They dismounted. Two of them crossed the river and began to gather wood, their axes moving with sharp, efficient strokes. Another started a fire using flint and steel, and soon a healthy blaze was crackling near the cabin door. Two Elk set his daughter down, and she was immediately surrounded by the other men, wrapped in thick furs, given small pieces of dried meat from their own pouches. Two Elk walked back to Elias, who stood watching, confused. The Arapaho leader motioned him toward the fire. "Sit," he said. Elias sat. He was weak, and the warmth felt good. One of the warriors brought him a water skin. He drank. The warrior then handed him a piece of smoked buffalo. It was rich and sweet, and he ate it slowly, feeling the strength flow back into his limbs. He ate, and the warriors worked. They were not paying him, they were resupplying him. They brought bundles from their horses. They piled firewood by his door, enough to last a month. They brought furs, beaver, mink, fox, more than he could have trapped in a whole season. They brought bags of dried corn, tobacco, and 3 large cuts of smoked buffalo. His empty cabin was filled. His empty shelf was overflowing. He had given them a single strip of venison. They were giving him back the winter. 2 elk sat across the fire from him. His daughter was asleep on his lap. She was lost, 2 elk said quietly. We were hunting. A blizzard came from the north. We were separated. We looked for 2 days. We found her tracks. They led here. He paused. We have found our children in white men's cabins before. It did not end well. He looked Elias in the eye. You are not like them. I am just a man, Elias said. She was cold. The cold is one enemy, 2 elk said. Hunger is another. A man who is full will share his food. It costs him nothing. But a man who is starving, he shares his soul. Elias looked at the pile of provisions. This is too much. It is not a gift, 2 elk said. It is a balance. The mountains watched. The land knows. You honored my blood. My people honor yours. The debt is paid. Elias looked at the tall warrior. He understood. This was not trade. This was the law of the high country, a life for a life, an act of honor returned in kind. He had been alone, but he was not. He was part of the land, and the land, through its people, had provided. He had given his last meal, and in return, they had given him back his life. As the sun cleared the peaks, the Arapaho made ready to leave. The fog had burned off, and the valley was sharp and white. The horses were brought. The warriors mounted. Their faces no longer grim, but full of the relief of a search concluded. Morning Star, awake now and wrapped in warm furs, was placed on her father's horse. She looked at Elias. She did not smile, but she held his gaze. A small, silent understanding passed between them. 2 elk rode his horse up to the cabin. He looked down at Elias. The Ute moved north, he said. They are hungry. They will not be generous. Be watchful. It was a warning and a gift. Information was as valuable as food. Elias nodded. I will be watchful. Travel safe, 2 elk. The warrior nodded. He turned his horse, but before he rode, he looked back one last time. You are welcome in my lodge, he said. My food is your food. Then he was gone, leading his men east toward the plains. Elias watched them until they were just dark specks against the snow, disappearing into the pines. The riverbank was empty once more. The silence returned, but it was a different silence. It was not the empty, hollow silence of solitude. It was the full, rich silence of a world that was in balance. He turned and went back inside his cabin. It was warm. The fire crackled. The smell of smoked meat and coffee filled the air. His life, which had been down to its last cold ember, was full again. He was no longer a ghost, hiding from his past. He was a man, bound to this place, bound by an act of honor. He had come to the mountains seeking emptiness. Instead, he had found connection. He learned that day that courage is not about fighting, it is about giving. It is not about the rifle in your hand, but the food you are willing to give from it. The mountains demand much, but they also reward. They test a man's spirit. They find out what he is made of. Elias Thorne had been tested, and he had been found worthy, not by his own strength, but by his willingness to share his last weakness. The wind in the pines carries this truth. Honor is not a word. It is a choice. It is the last meal given freely. It is the debt paid not in gold, but in respect. and it is the quiet understanding that we are all, in the end, just travelers, looking for a warm fire and a safe place to rest. If you enjoyed this story, stay a while longer by the fire. There are more tales from the high country, where honor rides the wind.